I'm very happy to be hosting this conversation with Karthik Muralidharan, who's the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego, and also holds various important professional positions relating to his role as a leader of randomized controlled trials and development and a researcher on public service provision broadly and and state capacity. The context is a book that came out a year ago. It's called Accelerating India's Development, a state-led roadmap for effective governance. This is the book. I use it every morning to exercise, when I'm too lazy to go to the gym. This book is rightly celebrated for a variety of reasons that I'll come to in a minute. But in particular, it is worth mentioning that it won the Crosswood Book Award in the business and management category. And in particular, the citation mentions this as an exceptional work that stands out for its originality, depth of research, and the practical evidence-based strategies and conceptual framework it offers. Okay, it's a longer citation, but since I will talk about my own assessment or whatever summary of what I learned from the book. And I should also mention that as a long-term professional colleague of Karthik and also more recently a co-author on a policy research piece we did on universal basic income, a particular form for India, he was gracious and kind enough to send me a complimentary copy, which I cannot carry it around, but it has a very prominent place on my bookshelf. So now on to the substance of this, and I guess I didn't introduce myself, but since I'm host, I'm Maitreesh Ghatak. I am Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, and I'm also one of the editors of Ideas for India, that is hosting this event. I thank the Ideas for India team, and in particular, Parikshit Ghosh, the editor-in-chief. It was whose idea and insistence that we do this event, and I'm glad we are here. So let me start off. I mean, it's a very ambitious book. It spans 18 chapters and 600 pages of text and notes and other things aside. But I have to say that just to start off by saying it's actually extremely readable. So one should not be intimidated by its size as well as the scope and ambition of what it tries to achieve. And I think that's not easy to do, but it is written extremely lucidly and it can be read very, very kind of continuously. Often in academic books, that's not the case. Now, I basically see at least like kind of 3 different books that are showing up in the guise of one book with this title. So those interested in India's development experience and its challenges will find an excellent discussion of the problems as well as the potential causes and solutions. Of course, he focuses on state capacity, so therefore that gets primacy. But it's also a very, very good overall discussion of what are India's sort of strengths and weaknesses of its economic performance, kind of somewhat big picture view of its economic record since, since independence, broad trends, where it's lagging, where it's done well. So I think it's done very, very lucidly and very, it's sort of, for students as well as the general reading public, it would be valued for that alone, right? It's an excellent book on the Indian economy and various problems and solutions. But as somebody who has been in the field of development economics for a long time, I am senior to Karthik. We share our alma mater, at least in our PhD, Harvard University. He was about maybe a decade junior to me. Certainly in the last 2 decades, he has been prolific in his research as well as policy writing. So I consider him a peer, not at all a junior in any way. So we have learned a lot from Karthik's work. Now, from that point of view, those who are interested in development issues more broadly, so for a more global audience, they will find an implicit framework here that is quite rich. And although it's on India, if you wanted to apply the template to sort of any other developing country, it starts off with a bird's eye summary of the overall trends and then swoops in and looks at the actors that are the central to the book's argument: the politician, the bureaucrat, police, courts, also the building blocks to his argument: data and outcome measurement, personnel management, expenditure revenue side of public finance, issues of federalism. These are all very much core building blocks of any sort of good discussion on political economy of development or state capacity. And then it, of course, within this broad development theme, it looks at the broad issues relating to the role of the state vis-a-vis the market, and then goes into very specific sectors. Frankly, I'll be, while I like the other bits, but given my own specialization in development, as well as writing a fair bit on the Indian economy, where I found the most sort of the meaty sections where he essentially looks at specific sectors such as education, health, social protection, jobs. This is where the meat is, and of course the rest of the building block is needed. That's the scaffolding on which this is put. And this is where I would say this is a sort of third implicit book that is lurking here, which is basically Karthik's role as a leading researcher of carrying out large-scale randomized controlled trials. And he has emerged as a leading authority in the field of development economics in terms of understanding how the public sector works, how the various branches of the state works, how to improve accountability, monitoring, and incentives. So as I said, that therefore one could read it in, parallelly with these three sort of, possible books, all kind of merged and in a relatively seamless way. Now, I will now, of course, sort of sum up what my basic take on it, but since it's a conversation and I'm actually looking forward to having a chat with Karthik. We have had many chats on the book itself and many others over the years. So my summary take on it is, as somebody who has been working on issues of incentives and organization design in the context of public sector and various non-market, non-state actors like NGOs, non-profits, this is a field in which, I'm glad that in the last 2 decades, Karthik and some of his colleagues and co-authors have really thrown in a lot of sort of rich evidence and conceptual angles that some of us who have been working on this for a while, we find it extremely sort of heartening that this has now become a popular field. Many people are working on it, right? Whereas early on, when we were perhaps grad students, or later in our early, it was all about sort of, the government sector and government failure. This was sort of the generic picture that we would study. Now we have opened the black box, I think in the last 2 decades, we have a lot going on in terms of opening that black box and see a vast organization with various layers that teaming with people, issues of coordination, monitoring, accountability. So it's not just some, monolith, right? So I find this is, I learned a lot from it. And in particular, as I said, that I find the weaving together of these different themes to be particularly impressive. I have some disagreements about the thrust of some of the arguments, which is natural, right? Because he is taking a particular, view of what ails India's development trajectory. And if you take a specific sort of angle, there's always, other angles, and whether, so that is a discussion that is worthwhile having. But I also, while I'll point out some of these disagreements as we go on, I recommend the book without any hesitation, strongly to anybody interested in India's overall economic problems or development economics or issues of public organization and state capacity. I think it's a must-read book. And congratulations to Karthik for, I know it's not easy to take time off of sort of, research, which is very demanding. And I think there's an amount of sort of public service here in terms of putting it in the public domain. So now that I've done that, and we would like to hear Karthik's views, I will start off by kind of going on certain specific arguments of your book, which, given my own aptitude and inclination, I was more drawn to and I engage more with, but then I'll come to more broad conceptual issues. So you have shown the potential from big returns from improvements in state capacity. In some ways, that's the core meat of your argument, that there are, things that you could do that could lead to big improvements in state capacity. And some of the calculations you do from the studies you've done is that sometimes it can be even 10 times the cost of undertaking these investments in state capacity. Now, while we know that in the private sector, such unexploited gains will not be, lying idle, somebody will come and make private profits out of that. We understand that because of ignorance and how government works and the opacity and lack of accountability, potential gains could well be there. So otherwise, if somebody found that in a big corporation this was going on, there would be an element of incredulity that why would somebody not figure this out? Why would it take academics or researchers to do this? But I was thinking that in some ways, the dominant theme in your approach is a bit of a techno-management engineering approach, which is fine. We economists, we do it in various contexts. But could it be that essentially state capacity in India is or elsewhere is what it is because of power struggles, political compulsions, how political parties raise money, and how the whole politician, bureaucrat, businessman, local elites, that whole nexus works out? Or do you think there's enough space to focus on some things that are win-win or low-hanging fruits that we could all sit around the table and say, let's do it? Over to you, Karthik.
Yeah, so, yeah. So thanks, Maitreesh. So I think so. Before I answer that specific thing, right? Let me, I think, frame what I think are maybe some of the few key points, right, and then come back to that specific question. See, I think the core reason for writing this book, right, I mean, is that normally as economists, when we talk about policy, we normally papers are policy recommendations about what the government should do, right? I mean, and that's kind of where the discourse is. The public discourse will usually say, oh, government should prioritize this sector or that sector, where is the budget allocation? But the point about the 10x return is to say that as economists and as the public discourse, we keep asking what the government should do, but we don't ask how will it do it or can it even do it, right? I mean, and the core point here is that whatever your view may be, right, you may be center right and believe that the government should focus on capital expenditure and promote growth. You may be on the center left and believe that the government should prioritize the social sector, right? But regardless of what your kind of view of what the government should do is, the government still is incredibly weak in doing that and converting the spending into outcomes, right? So the common thread across 20 years of my work, whether it's in education and then in the delivery of welfare programs and early childhood and sector after sector, you basically see that the return on investment of better governance and state capacity is often 10 times more, right? I mean, than simply spending in a government as usual way. Okay. So then you ask this interesting question, how much of this is because of the political and bureaucratic incentives? And the answer is, of course, it's because of that, right? I mean, and that's kind of why I have a chapter 2 and chapter 3. Even before I get into the details of the technocratic ideas in the book, there is first a framing of what the incentives and constraints are of the two key actors who make up the state, right? I mean, who are the bureaucrats and the politicians. And the basic problem is that, for the politicians, the time horizon over which the returns to state capacity show up are typically kind of long term. And the electoral cycle doesn't always incentivize that, right? Which is why, the theoretical work on state capacity has established quite well that, and this is true in Besley Person, it's there in a whole bunch of classic models as well. And it's true in historical political economy that countries normally invest in state capacity only in times of existential crisis, right? Either it's in times of war or in times of kind of formation of a country, right? So I think there is a broader point here, and I'll come back to that if I have a moment. See, it's if you look at, might as well talk about it now, right? I mean, so if you look at the 2024 Nobel Prize on institutions for Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, right? So one of their kind of core ideas is that countries that have inclusive institutions, which is broadly framed as representative democracy and certain constraints on kind of executive overreach, so that this protection of freedoms of speech and freedom of property, etc., that these inclusive institutions on average get you longer term growth. Now, The thing is, what they kind of underemphasize is that the electoral democracy by itself does not necessarily create the incentives to invest in state capacity, which is why they're not able to explain East Asia as well, right? And so this is well known and well documented as a limitation of kind of AJR, right? So one way to say this is it's precisely because the electoral incentives don't always give you the reasons to invest in state capacity that you end up with this low hanging fruit, right? And so then what is my role here as a scholar bringing this is to say that yes, there are electoral incentives that kind of, determine how politicians act. But once they get into office, they still care about getting something right. And when they turn to the technical economist and saying, hey, what would you do? Right? One way to say this is that your typical economic advice tends to be on what sector to focus on. Whereas if that same question were to be asked to me, I would say that the highest return on investment is actually investing in better state capacity because you're going to get higher ROI everywhere, right? So I think the point is it's exactly right that the underinvestments in state capacity is an endogenous outcome of the political incentives we are in, as well as kind of the pressures that the bureaucracy is under to deliver when they don't have the resources, which means, the analogy I use, I think, in the book works out quite well, right? Which is just like the 1950s ambassador car was the metaphor
Right.
for the pre-liberalization Indian economy, it is a good metaphor for the Indian state, which is over time we have kept on adding burdens and expectations on the state, without necessarily investing in its capacity to deliver, right? So the politicians are like the race car drivers of this 1950s ambassador car, figuring out in which direction to drive the car, in which passengers to prioritize. But the car is barely moving, right? I mean, and the bureaucrats are like the engines and the body and the wheels of this car, and they're trying to keep it moving, but also don't have the time to re-engineer it, right? So part of the role of the academic here is we've done the research and have the ability to kind of take a step back and look at the structures and then say that here is the micro evidence that points to the returns to state capacity. But let's kind of not just say, hey, scale up this or scale up that, because you really then have to take a systems level view. And that's basically what the book is doing, that the first half is really saying, let's look at org theory and look at what are kind of the components of effective organizations, and then organize the high kind of large body of high quality micro evidence along those principles. And then the second half says, listen, like, the goal here is not, like you said, the meat that you got excited about is in the second half. That's because what we care about is not just the state, we care about actual development, right? I mean, and part of the point is to say that you can't in fact accelerate development without building a more effective state. So yeah, I think it's a long way of saying that you're absolutely right that the status quo is kind of an endogenous result of a set of political and bureaucratic incentives, and the role of the academic is to kind of shed light on the fact that you may be missing some opportunities, and that's really all that we can do, and then make the case to kind of to the policymakers to say this is in fact the lowest hanging fruit of what you may want to focus on.
No, that's fair enough. In fact, a quick sort of set of reactions. I think that just on a sort of more light note, I thought that a 1950s, public bus would have been a better analogy, because that way you can also, sort of the metaphor can allude to the crowdedness and the congestion of the public who are all trying to sort of jostle for space. But on a more serious note, though, I think maybe because it's for a broader audience, I didn't want to use too narrow terms, but maybe let me try to take another crack at what I was implicit in the question. That look, there is that, Ashimoglu argument, why not a political cost theorem? So in other words, suppose there are things that we could all agree that if we could stick to, then both, before reaching an agreement and after reaching an agreement, we can all stick to it and we can all be better off. So there's no conflict. Now, of course, there are domains of economics, whether you take a basic sort of fighting for resources type of argument, which is more kind of left political economy view of things, right? Wealth inequality, control over natural resources, displacement of farmers and sort of tribals. But here, the implicit premise is there's win-win options. And everybody would be better off, even though, like all of us, in the very immediate short run, we may not like sort of, kind of waking up in the morning and showing up for work, and we might as well, take it easy. So therefore, we can all think that if we take a more benign view of what's good for us and what we should be doing, we can all agree on that. But here, my sort of skepticism, where I'm coming from, is really the space for how much of, what would be, suppose if we take the metric to be 100 of all the problems relating to state capacity, what percentage of that, that 100 would these sort of win-win low-hanging fruits be? And I had a conjecture based on reading some of the specifics of your book and your articles. Maybe the digital technology has been something that fell from above, right? And that has given us this, what is the classic sort of exogenous boost of a certain resource. And that can be leveraged to create some win-wins, because otherwise, every time you enforce a law, every time you try to improve accountability, somebody is getting hurt. And that person will fight tooth and nail to prevent that. And that is why we have kind of weak and beleaguered state capacity to start with. So I would say that's a more, refined version of what I was trying to ask. But fair enough. I guess the empirical question, which may be hard to answer in the same way as macroeconomists do development accounting or growth accounting, is in this accounting of various shortfalls of state capacity, what fraction of that could basically lend itself to these win-win strategies, which all of us can sit in the room and agree and feel good about, right? It's like, don't throw garbage out in the open. We can all agree that if we can all stick to that, there's no broad conflict of interest.
Yeah. So again, I think the framework in chapter 6, right, I think is something I would draw attention for a lot of readers, right, where essentially it's just saying, let's look at major line items of public expenditure and classify them on a 2 by 2 of kind of impacts on equity and efficiency. And so even if you don't have, complete win-wins of saying
Yeah,
Pareto improvement, because you're right, because there will always be some vested interest, right,
I,
I
you
mean,
know,
who are
and
going to lose
I
out. And I think that framework is
what I
something that I
liked
hope.
about it, and if I summarize as as a reader, because I thought that was effective, even though of course I didn't raise it in my brief summary, is that you're basically saying there are things that lead to an efficiency equity trade-off, and there are things that do not lead to an efficiency equity trade-off, right? But then there are a bunch of things where you could, essentially that's like a lose-lose. You have less equity and less efficiency, right?
Mhm.
And those are the margins in which you could basically get rid of, so maybe that's the space I was referring to, that which are the policies which we could all agree that they make no
Mhm.
sense and it's not benefiting anybody, right? So fair
Yeah,
enough.
yeah, exactly, right. And so I think like expecting a Pareto improvement might be a little country of 1.4 billion people, it's going to be hard to do things that don't make somebody worse off, right? Because even with our work on smart cards and reducing corruption, clearly the middlemen who were making money are worse off, right? So, but the point is, in the end, if an overwhelming number of people are better off, then that creates the political support to do that. So, in fact, I say this in that chapter too, right? When I'm talking about the political incentives to invest
Yeah.
in state capacity, right? Which is the one of the most interesting comments I got from a senior IAS officer when we talked about the biometric smart cards and how it reduced corruption. So he said something incredibly profound, right? He said the miracle is not that the technology worked. He said the miracle is that the technology was allowed to work. Okay, like, which is
That's a
essentially
good point.
right. I mean, because the whole point is the political economy, right? In
Yeah.
which is the corruption in the welfare programs is usually the lubricant that kind of keeps the lower level political party operatives kind of, compensated and fed and incentivized. So the fact that the political leadership was willing to take the calculation that the benefits from improving services for the vast majority of the poor were going to exceed the costs of kind of, cutting the rent seeking ability of some middlemen itself was an interesting kind of political economy calculation, right? So even with something like technology, it isn't always going to be Pareto improving. Now, the point of that picture is just to say, again, as economists, I think it's very useful to step back, and I say this in chapter 17, right, which is the framework for making sense of what policies are finally adopted that I find the most useful is this framework of ideas, interests, and institutions, right? So, I mean, obviously there are interests, and that's politics. There's institutions that kind of set the rules of the game. But again, our role as researchers is to populate the public space of ideas, right? I mean, so that it feeds into the public discourse, and the concerned kind of political actors can then respond to that, right? So part of what I'm trying to do there is just saying that the research has, see, where is the free lunch? Okay, the free lunch that I'm saying is that, and this can bring us back to the point in RCTs, is that, see, the biggest, what have we as a profession, right? What have we done in the past 20 years? Where have we really advanced our knowledge, right? There has been an explosion in micro data sets, explosion in computing power, right? I mean, and kind of a much greater attention paid to causal inference. And so what that's allowed us to do is identify that we spend an enormous amounts of money on things that are completely ineffective. And on the other hand, there are kind of low hanging fruit that can improve both equity and efficiency that we are not kind of investing enough in. And so part of the point in the book is to say that a lot of our public discourse, so again, in my 2 by 2, the point is quadrant 1 are ideas that can improve both equity and efficiency, right? Quadrant 3 are the ones that hurt both. And then quadrant 2 and 4 are the ones that are good for one, bad for the other, right? So a lot of our public discourse tends to focus on quadrant 2 versus quadrant 4, right? So there are many, many ideas. So to give you one example, moving to a uniform GST would almost certainly improve the efficiency of tax collection, right? It would reduce kind of the compliance costs, the distortions, the lobbying, the expectations, but it would be regressive because it would increase the effective tax rates on the poorest, right? I mean, if you were to move to a uniform GST, and you can have other policies that may promote equity like the PDS, but you could argue that it's bad for efficiency in terms of the distortions in kind of, agriculture markets. But what I want to highlight is that if you just take the case of, say, rural welfare, right? I mean, and think about two classes of policies. On one side, we have something like NREGA, like, where we show that this has been effective for both equity and efficiency, right? On the other hand, you have something like free electricity for farmers, where we still spend tens of thousands of crores, if not lakhs of crores, aggregated across all the states. And that ends up being one of a policy that's incredibly inequitable, because if you look at the distribution of land holdings, the top 5% of landholders get about 50% of the subsidies, and it's also incredibly inefficient in terms of what that does to the groundwater table, as well as distorting cropping patterns, as well as hurting industry through the cross subsidy of industrial power, and also partly responsible for the pollution in the Gangetic belt in the winter because of the stubble burning that happens in places that should not be growing paddy, right? So those are then just like powerful examples of saying, listen, we spend an enormous amount of money on things that are bad for both equity and efficiency, and we underinvest, right? So to take the case of human development, right? Where does most of our money go? Most of our money goes to unconditional increases of salaries of regular government workers, right? Government teachers. And study after study, both kind of value added and experimental, shows that those unconditional salary increases have no effect whatsoever on productivity, right? And then given the marginal cost of public funds is about 2.5, it's not just a costless transfer, right? It's actually like something that is hurting, it's hurting social welfare to be able to raise tax revenue to basically make a transfer to people who are already in the top 5% of their income distribution, and has no impact on productivity, right? On the other hand, we've got evidence from, say, our study in Tamil Nadu of putting like a second Anganwadi worker in the community who's focused on preschool education, right? That we find has a dramatic positive impact on improving learning outcomes and reducing malnutrition. And we estimate that the return on investment of doing this is somewhere between 1,200 to 2,000%. Okay. So again, the value of the evidence is that it's not like the idea per se is new, right? I think the child rights advocates have been asking for a second worker in the Anganwadi since the early 2000s. Okay. But it doesn't happen because the government says we don't have the money. But where does the money go? The money goes to unconditional pay increases of existing workers, correct? So I think just by putting out the research and showing the juxtaposition of saying even within a sectoral budget that there are kind of incredibly, you can enormously improve outcomes within the same budget envelope by kind of pivoting expenditure from things that are kind of completely ineffective to those that are. So that's really the core.
Let me sum up by what I'm understanding from this exchange and focusing again on my, the question, that you're saying that maybe I can think of three factors, underlying mechanisms, which, which could be suggesting there could be many such, many or some such opportunities of win-win policies that could well be adopted. One is, as I said, that there could be technological changes that has made certain things, possible. We mentioned that. Second, which is you could argue that implicitly, maybe what you were saying, that researchers do find out stuff that others have not figured out. Sometimes, just to go to some place A to B, you follow some road, but then somebody shows you that if you take this shortcut or if you this, you will go faster. So I think that's where I think some of those very intensive field-based research that you have carried out, and those are, and that could potentially be win-win. Nobody will argue that, yeah, this is a better way of doing it. And the third, maybe what you said about the senior bureaucrat who told you that it's a miracle that some of these get adopted, right? That is the whole thing, is well be the political competition. And, and this is, so I'm again looking at it from an economic systems, economic theory point of view, as opposed to the various contextual details, which are of course important in a book like this. But with that, since I guess we agree on that, let me move to the second sort of broad question, which also will bring us to some of the RCT as a method type of question, and not, of course, getting into methodological questions, but more the policy relevance. You have already mentioned in your answer to the previous question, you brought up some of the specific schemes you have studied, and I had listed in my question the Telangana's Raitu Bandhu scheme, the Narega, your study, which is very well known, and teacher incentives, where simple monitoring incentive system in all these cases could lead to big gains in terms of cutting corruption, absenteeism, reducing delays, and improving targeting. So I'm, of course, doing a very, very broad summary across a whole range of research, and not all of them are kind of the same set of issues, but that's a broad summary of what you are finding, right? But I have a conceptual question here, which is, see, because you are sort of research entrepreneur, so to speak, right? You have an idea, you want to sort of, then you have funds, and you have collaborating with the governments, and you show that, look, if I press this button, if I do it this, a bit differently, and you have indeed done it at impressively large scales compared to the usual RCTs, which is something that I've always appreciated about your work, that it's not just a couple of maybe 100 villages, but you're doing statewide interventions. So I think, therefore, that gives it certainly a lot more external validity type justification. But I always worry this about RCTs is it's like once a film is over, once the crew packs up the set and leaves, right? What happens, right? The experimenters were there. They worked with the bureaucrats. They worked with the local population. They did an intervention. They did it well. In your case, I know. How do we know that after this is done and published and disseminated, that the governments will adopt them? And if they do, and this is the core thing, they will work exactly in the same way as your original study permitted, which is what is giving you 10x type returns, right? And this is it's the classic thing. You have shown a possibility. You have taken a certain equilibrium. You have stepped in as an external agent, and you have shown a possibility that you could do this. But then you'll have to go away, and these agents, various actors will have to play a new equilibrium with this knowledge or even some policy reformulation. And this is where I was just wondering whether you have some, and again, you know this literature in which I have worked on, and you have of course done a lot of work too, that we all know that incentives, accountability, all these are good things, but we also know that incentives lead to gaming and collusion, and they may nullify their effect and even lead to worsening outcomes, right? And this is always is something that bugs me about a bunch of these studies, which is not to say we ignore them. We learn useful stuff from them, but the second step as to how will that be part of a new equilibrium to have sustained effects.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot there, and let me again just give you a few high-level answers, right? So I think the first is that there is a reason why the way I approach the book, right, is very rarely saying this study found X, we should scale this up. Okay. Whereas what I'm doing is I'm using the body of evidence to extract a set of principles, right? And so what are the principles that emerge from the studies rather than saying that, hey, go scale this up, right? So for example, on the issues of gaming and measurement, even though my original job market paper dissertation was on teacher performance pay, I have never actually recommended the scaling up of that, right? And the reason is I know that we don't have the data integrity to be able to do that because, data gets gamed even without incentives. Okay. So then the question is, why do that study? What do we learn from it, right? And I think what we learn from that is that there is so much slack in a typical kind of teacher's day that even a modest amount of kind of performance-based pay that is kind of giving you 3 to 5%, if well implemented, right, could have a bigger impact than like almost, anything else that we spend our money on. Okay. So what it does is it highlights, right, how kind of low hanging the fruit is. So here's another way of describing this, okay, which is to say, there is a standard tropish way of thinking about RCTs, which is to say, hey, let's find out if a program works and let's scale it up. And I have typically not approached my RCTs that way. Okay, so there's a different way of looking at an RCT, which so Orazio Athanasio's presidential address in the European Economic Association, I think in 2015, talks about this, right? Which is you can look at any outcome that you observe as an equilibrium outcome that reflects a combination of preferences, beliefs, and constraints. Okay, and so then you can think about what the RCT is doing is that it is giving you an exogenous shifter in one of those things and then allows you to identify, right? How much that equilibrium shifts when you shift that. So, and then what the RCT is doing is it's kind of helping you tease out certain constraints and certain principles rather than saying you want to scale exactly this. Okay. And that's exactly why the approach I'm taking to the book, and I think this goes back to your point about what is the guarantee or what is the thing that says, hey, this will continue to be implemented even when you are not there, right? And that's exactly why the approach in the book is not focusing on scaling up a specific intervention, right? It is focusing on how do you build the public systems so that on an ongoing basis, you're institutionalizing ways of functioning that will kind of get the government and the state as a whole to be more efficient, right? So when you look about, and that's why those 6 chapters, right? If you look at those 6 chapters, which are the core of the book on data and outcome measurement, personnel management, public finance expenditure, public finance revenue, federalism, decentralization, state and market. The interesting thing is those 6 principles apply to effective organizations in the public sector or in the private sector or in the nonprofit sector, right? So if you look at any private organization, what drives organizational effectiveness? You talked, and this also reflects some of my consulting experience, right? I've been in the private sector for 2 years. So it's not, and I took, so one of the fun things about writing the book is that my research in terms of papers may have just been, narrow RCTs, but the courses in grad school spanned public finance and political economy and organizations. I sat in Bob Gibbons' entire class on organizations, right? So it didn't show up in the research, but it showed up in the book because it kind of reflects this broader thinking. So that's why the way I think about this is that the building blocks of the evidence that inform the larger narrative in the book are coming from RCTs. But the message of the book is explicitly not to scale up like, hey, this little RCT was successful and therefore you should scale this up, right? It's more, what are the principles that we're extracting from that that can then help us build better organizations, in this case, better public systems, right? So coming back to org theory, or just kind of org practice, right? So what drives org culture? Any private sector person you talk to will say, what are my quarterly targets, right? What am I being measured on? What am I being held accountable for? That drives kind of the entire kind of pressure within the company, right? So that's why I start with data and outcome measurement and highlight, just how much low hanging fruit there is. And if you can build better systems, like, not just for data collection. So one way of saying this is that India has had historically a fantastic statistical infrastructure, but that was really much more a retrospective set of statistics for understanding how we have done, but rarely kind of been data for decision making, right? That can drive operational improvement in governance and use of government resources, right? So there's data and outcome measurement, which is just central to effectiveness. Then the second pillar is personnel management, right? How do you hire? How do you pay? How do you promote? And again, these are things that transcend public and private, right? So how do you spend your money? What is your revenue model? If you're a large global MNC, what do you do in the global headquarters, national headquarters, field headquarters, which is what is in the federalism and decentralization chapter, right? It's exactly the same set of issues. What should you do at a national government, at a state government, at a local government? And then the state in the market is COS 1937, right? What's the boundary of the firm? And so an effective organization will know what to do in-house and what to source outside, right? So the point is, therefore, that each of these areas each have had fantastic RCT research, but the intellectual contribution of the book is to bring those building blocks of the evidence and kind of structure this with a broader view of principles of effective organizations. And the
Right.
hope is that if you do that, then you're kind of building the institutional systems that will get you better governance over time. So again, the examples in the public finance chapter, I think, are a particularly good example, right? See, if you spend time and the book reflects not just the time I've spent doing studies, right? It reflects the amount of time spent in government, advising government, understanding how government works. Okay. So if you just look at how budgets are made, right? I mean, it would be shocking because most budgets every year will be that there will be a few pet priorities that the chief minister will have that you will make the money for. Otherwise, every other department will just get, like, a mechanical increase that proportionately goes to kind of what they're
Right,
already doing.
right.
So if you're able to go in there and implement some of those ideas in chapter 6, then it's about how do you bend the curve of budget allocation over time towards reflecting more cost effectiveness and efficiency, right? So that's why the core argument of the book is not scale up what is in the RCT. It is how do we use the RCTs to learn principles that can then inform, like, this larger point about how do you build an effective state.
Okay, Karthik, let me summarize what my preoccupation was, and which was the scaling up clarification is a good one. But I still would say that many of the incentives that are being tested in our cities, and not just your work, I mean, across, now private organizations and public organizations, right? They are not necessarily, we already know from theory, they're not going to be renegotiation proof or collusion proof. For example,
Mhm,
you give teachers incentives on something. We all know how you're going to work with the headmaster or the head teacher or who's the supervisor and then try to game it, right? And this is the whole
mhm,
literature
mhm,
that give me an incentive scheme. In fact, it's Bob Gibbons in one of his
mhm,
courses who, when I was chatting with him, he told me that, just show me an incentive scheme and I'll show you exactly how to beat it. But
mhm,
it's not a fair question to ask. In some ways, it was useful to have your thought, but we need to take the first steps. And maybe the goal here should be taking on more collusion-proof type incentives, which we can all agree that once it's left in place, it'll
mhm,
be not easy to disturb it, right? And this is, for example, the Renika Svensson type thing, where you just commit to publish certain expenditures in
mhm.
schools, and parent teachers meetings, then there'll be more accountability pressure as opposed to relying on specific agents. Good to sort of have your views on a range of these issues, and once again, we can only do justice to a very fraction of the rich set of issues and conceptual points your book makes. So I want to ask a very, very sort of general question, since these other two were more specific, that essentially, what would you think of as more permanent investments, or your book argues as permanent investments? It's like writing a rule that we all stick to, and if
Mhm,
anybody is in violation, yeah, that would in a way sustain this, as opposed
mhm,
to, I mean, the inevitable malpractices that'll crap up, bad apples that'll be there and who'll try to somehow skirt around it, right?
mhm.
What would you think as to, in some ways, the meta interventions, that would kind of keep the system integrity?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, right? And I think, see, to me, the meta interventions that likely have the most important staying power are kind of micro interventions to improve the budget process. Okay. Like, I mean, and let me channel again your colleague Oriana's work, right? I mean, which is when people think about inefficiency in government, we often think about corruption. But one of the key insights in her 2009 AR paper is that, I think she estimates in that context that only 17% is corruption, the other 83% is inefficiency, right? Like, I mean, so what I would say is, having observed budget processes, like, I mean, there is so much low hanging fruit, right? I mean, so I'll give you a very simple example, okay? So, in multiple departments where we worked on, so one case was a tax department, right, where you see that certain revenue circles were made 20 years ago, and then there has been dramatic difference in kind of the revenue growth in tax SSCs, but the headcount is not shifted in 25 years. So then you go and do an analysis and you'll see that some circles have 3,000 SSCs per GST officer and others have 45,000. Okay, so we have done these numbers and you present that, and the commissioner goes like, oh my God, nobody's looked at this in 20 years. Okay, and then they go and rationalize that, right? So something as simple as saying, as part of every year's budget process, given that for many departments, personnel are one of the biggest line items, that the department has to automatically do like a staff rationalization exercise as part of the budget process. Okay, it sounds incredibly low hanging fruit, but nobody's doing this. Okay, so nobody's doing this, and this has got nothing to do with corruption, nothing to do with this thing. It's just pure inertia within kind of a bureaucracy, because they are understaffed and under equipped to even put in place certain processes like this. Okay, so some of the most interesting, I think, analysis and work we've done is in public procurement, right? So again, people think about procurement from a corruption perspective, but there is so much inefficiency, right? I mean, that you can basically squeeze out. And I'll give you another favorite example with regard to incentivizing. So, because you asked a very, very good question, right? I mean, which is how do you change the rules of the game in a way that these things will stick? Okay. So, I think, and that's exactly the right question, which is why I don't approach this point about incentives as saying, hey, provide this level of performance pay. It's more kind of channeling economics 101 that says incentives matter. Okay. So today, very few line departments have any incentive to be cost effective. Okay. And the reason is that if a department saves money, finance will usually take the money back. Okay. And so I have talked to a commissioner of education in kind of, in a major Indian state who said, he had worked very, very hard to use biometrics and kind of field verification to reduce fraudulent enrollment and duplicate enrollment, right? Where kids will often enroll in the government school, attend the private school. So they managed to identify about 4 to 5% of kids and save like a few hundred crores. But what he said is, but they had a bunch of other priorities that would improve education that they wanted to fund. And but when they saved this money, finance took the money back. And this happens in every state, right? I mean, so even a very simple change in the budget rules that says, where the finance department tells every department every year to say, identify your top three priorities for new expenditure if you were to have the money, and justify that with some basic kind of equity efficiency kind of calculation. And at the same time, you identify, because you are the one closest to the ground, that what might be the areas where we can save money. Okay. And what I promise you is, if you save that money by identifying inefficiencies, you will get that money back, right, mean to fund your priorities. Okay. So that's an example of these kind of changes in budget rules and budget processes that I think can have a huge long-term impact. Because again, as economists and people who just kind of, really think at an abstract level without getting into the weeds of how government functions, my, strong belief and and conviction is that there is incredibly low hanging fruit there, and those are some of the ideas in chapter 6 which I've talked about.
Thank you. No, that's very insightful, and I think that you have certainly persuaded me, from the book and this conversation, that there are certain changes in certain procedures that even that are feasible and all the stakeholders can agree to, because it sort of releases, because we can all kind of get stuck in passive ways of doing certain things. I see that as part of being a fairly big university in the
And
UK.
if I may, like, given the US discussions right now on like government efficiency and stuff, like,
Mhm.
this is globally topical, right? See, I mean, in a way, this goes back to the classic debates kind of between public finance and public choice, right? So there's the
Yeah,
Musgrave,
yeah.
the Musgrave Buchanan debates of the 90s. And so, most of us in development and public finance come at it from a Musgravian public finance view, where you say, here are the market failures, here is kind of the challenges of inequity, here are the reasons government has to step in. But kind of in general, the center left wants the government to do things, but doesn't pay attention to how inefficient the government is, right? The right sees that inefficiency, right? But also sees, like, I mean, but doesn't trust the bureaucracy to ever make itself efficient. So the right's view is that you just have to shrink the state, because left to itself, like, I mean, it's just going to become the self-perpetuating beast, right? There is a whole bunch of things that we need the state to be doing to improve both equity and efficiency and welfare. But we also need to constantly pay attention to the efficiency with which the state itself functions, and kind of identify certain low hanging fruit that can kind of bend that, bend the beast of the state towards functioning more efficiently. And, people ask me the Doge question, and sometimes I say, hey, if you're unfit, right? I mean, you can get fit by diet and exercise, which is what I'm recommending, or you can lose weight by amputation. Okay. Like, I mean, which is what is sometimes happening, where you get like blind cuts without necessarily thinking through, what aspect of that particular department may be useful and what may not, right? So it takes a certain nuanced, patient approach to saying, here are core functions of the state that we wanted to do, but there is incredible inefficiency in here. And so how do you kind of squeeze that inefficiency out, in a patient way, and thereby improve efficiency all around?
I think that relating it to some of the debates that are going on in the US about taking axe or a chainsaw and amputating is therefore a natural analogy. But I want to sort of come to a sort of a finish to our broad discussion by raising one issue that some of the reviews of your book have mentioned, and we have had discussions about this. So let me sort of raise it, and in a way you prefaced it a bit by the Buchanan versus Musgrave thing. See, there's a certain, every time we think about sort of win-win or things that we could all agree, passive waste is the classic thing that in a jungle, a tiger and a deer can all sit by the river and say, okay, let's do these things in the jungle and we are all going to be better off, right? And that's well, right? And there may be certain things that it would do like that. But states are not always benign. Mm-hmm. And therefore, enhancing state capacity might be giving chainsaws to certain people, right? And as the very star visual metaphor that was flashed in various media outlets. So my worry is, and this is again, it's not specifically, I mean, your book is part of a broader consensus, some of which is I agree with, like some of the things you said about, the budgetary procedures and those things that can be and should be improved. But the broader reflection, and I really want a kind of micro answer from you, because at a big picture debate level, we cannot settle it. We can say, yeah, this problem is there, but this is the issue. That suppose, if governments are supposed to have checks and balances. That is the basis of the US government, the Indian government, the judiciary, the parliament, the executive branch, and all of that, right? So this should all be there. But enhancing state capacity, could also, in a way, upset this checks and balance procedure, right? Mm-hmm. And then one is not sure whether improving state capacity, so suppose you come up with a great win-win solution, is that a sort of nice knife you want to give to overall system? Just to give a casual example, which is not even, it's a, say income tax rate. So of course, corruption is wrong. People do evade income taxes. There is all that is true. But if you do not have if that system becomes extremely efficient, you also worry that states in the end reflect political interests. They have their all kinds of biases in India or elsewhere, right? So this is where I'm really ambivalent about, not ambivalent, let me put it more concretely. Shouldn't one also allow some inefficiency, which may be delays and due procedures, which from a certain point of view are not good because things get delayed, they have costs. But another point of view, they might put some buffer between the coercive powers that any state has and, say, vulnerable people, like some sort of poor lady who has to travel 50 miles to get her, a pension, and the Aadhaar thing doesn't work and glitches and things. Now, that can happen. I'm not saying we can make everything proof of technical problems or we should give up on technology altogether. But we all have been in government offices where in some ways we felt that there was zero weight on the welfare of the person who came and the time and effort. So I'm therefore thinking that is this a knife that it's best to leave a bit not so sharp or create some buffer?
No, absolutely. See, I think so. The one kind of, yeah, so I couldn't agree more that there is a real concern, right? That enhancing state capacity can be worse for citizen welfare, right? I mean, if that is in the hands of a malevolent actor, okay, which I think is broadly, the question. And it's also true that the state is not a benign creature and is often often captured by kind of powerful interests, right? I mean, who can then use the instruments of the state. Okay, so I think that point, right, is true regardless of whether the state has capacity or not. Okay, so my kind of broader argument here is that the democratic promise, right, I mean, is that there is a government that wants to deliver against what the voters want, and there is a democratic process that has also put some guardrails, right? I mean, so my simple point is that even the guardrails need capacity. Okay, so that if you think about our police, if you think about our courts, right? I mean, the fact that you have the kind of backlog in the courts means that you have de jure, there might be guardrails on paper. In practice, they don't exist because of the lack of capacity, right? So I think my simple point here is that this idea that prefer a weak state because, so that's kind of, seeing like a state argument that says we don't trust the state, right? And therefore we would prefer to have a weak state. But then don't, on the other hand, expect that, that same state is going to deliver against the democratic aspirations of the people, right? So the simple point is you can't have it both ways, right? You either want the state to deliver, in which case you have to make it capable, or you say, listen, I don't trust the state and I want to go live in, in an atomized utopia, right? So I think the other example is a good one, right? I think the right way to think about this is that, like any new technology, right? This was true of nuclear energy as well. This is true of any new technology, right? Has the potential for good and has the potential for harm. Okay. So as a society, the way, and that's true of now AI, it's true of, of bioengineering, genetic engineering. So every new technology, enhances certain capacity for good and also increases the capacity for counterproductive use. And as a society, the way we deal with this normally is saying we will have guardrails against, how this can be used. And that's exactly what should happen. And I think the other case is a good one, where, there were definitely people who opposed it on a variety of reasons. And then the courts came and ruled about what would be valid uses and not. Now, some of those are violated in practice because, again, there's a question of capacity of enforcing the law. But I think broadly speaking, I agree that capacity needs guardrails and the guardrails are as important as the capacity. So there's no disagreement.
No, I would agree, but I would push back a little bit about a conceptual point. Like you said, any change, any innovation, right? It has its power to do good and power to do bad, and we cannot sort of live in the caves or live in islands like Robinson Crusoe, right, and not be away from that. But in a way, we still do not want guns in the hands of small children, even though
Mm-hmm,
guns can be useful for hunting or other things. So what my point though is, in that, unless we are equally vocal and
mm-hmm,
equally sort of always flagging this, right, that you could say that, look, and this is true of, as you said, nuclear energy, name anything, right, that
mm-hmm,
you could basically, that can be potentially abused. But I think the worry is when you say state capacity can be good, state capacity can be bad, I feel you're making sort of binary something, a category that is inherently a huge abstraction, state capacity.
mm-hmm,
Some would say that fascist states had capacity. In the famous
mm-hmm,
line, the trains is
mm-hmm,
to run on time, right?
mm-hmm,
That's
mm-hmm,
state capacity too, right? And so my point is, again, I'm looking at it very abstractly and not at any specific kind of setting or whatever. You could have socialist states that abuse state capacity, all of that, right? So therefore, it's ideologically, you can apply it to any setting, any context. My worry, though, is it's a bit like, okay, maybe certain explosives are good if you want to sort of, create roads and, create sort of, passages through mountains and stuff, but you don't want small children to run around with explosives, right?
of course. Uh-huh.
So I'm just saying that isn't it incumbent on us as researchers then also to do large scale RCTs, which would exactly sort of tug at those strings. And therefore, you can have, therefore, the combination that, yes, this kind of forms of state capacity, say the government having lots of information about us, right? Which you could say with the other, the jam sort of idea that, in and of itself is a great idea, right? But you also worry that having so much information, and there have been, of course, public interest litigations and things like that. But this is what I'm thinking. Do you see a research agenda that would also kind of, in a way, now work on sheathing state capacity?
Yeah, so so the truth is just for simple ethical reasons, right? You would never ever want to kind of consider the consequences of a government doing something bad, right? I don't think that's an agenda that one would reasonably kind of say one should do experimentally, right? I think, but I agree with you, right? This is why. So again, let me give you a very good example, right? I think the concrete, it's always better concretely than abstractly because it sharpens what the trade-offs are. Okay. So when you look at the case of Aadhaar, right? So the closest I think, that we got to doing large scale RCTs that were, like in some cases worked unambiguously well, like in the case of smart cards in Andhra Pradesh. But when we did the biometric PDS in Jharkhand, right? We found that the results were a little bit more mixed, right?
Yeah.
And so there was a period of exclusion where certain people were in fact excluded during the transition period. Now, the point is that Now, the courts ruled, right? I mean, saying that you should roll it out, but you should, minimize exclusion. Now, the government did try, right? I mean, but they cannot get to every single case. How do you know where the pockets are? So this is exactly why we as a research team, right? I mean, then try to say that what is the problem here? Okay, the basic problem here is that the government sees the averages, right? I mean, and if 98% of people are getting, because the exclusion was about 2%, right? And they see the reduction in leakage, for the most part, they think that they're doing the right thing, right? Because that's kind
Mm,
of the scale at which they work in. Okay? But of course, the activists were right. I mean, that there was exclusion, correct? Like, so
mm,
the question
mm.
is, how do you find those pockets of exclusion and then go and correct that? And you can't do that without kind of having granular data, which is why we then devised the system of high frequency outbound calls, like, to be able to figure out what might be the pockets where things are not working. So then you can think about this as saying there is a trade off. And then what the state capacity in this case for, say, data collection, which I talk about in chapter 4, would do is it would basically reduce that trade off between the type 1 and type 2 error, right? Like, I mean, that was
Right.
happening alongside the rollout of the technology. Okay. So I think,
Yeah.
see, there is no question that my kind of discussion of state capacity here is happening in a context of a democratic state, right, that has a certain political legitimacy for what it is trying to do. Okay. And then I'm saying, given this is what you're trying to do, how can you do it better? Okay. So
Mm,
you're trying
mm.
to deliver education, you're trying to deliver health, you're trying to deliver child development, you're trying to deliver these things, but you're not able to deliver it, right? So I think there's a meta political question about, like, what the goals of the state are, how does it trade off, like, I mean, make different trade offs. And all my point in the book is to say, regardless of what your political priorities are and what that trade off is, investing in the right kind of capacity tools will allow you to fulfill whatever political mandate you have better. Okay. And I think that's the right way to think about
No, I
what the agenda of the book is.
no, I agree with that. No, I was thinking, I think that's a fair answer. And indeed, I would sort of, I think that what you said about this different states having different experiences vis-a-vis Aadhaar, I think you were very candid about it, as opposed to often in, any research, whatever we are studying, if it's giving wonderful results, there's always a bit of a researcher bias to highlight that. But I think it's as a responsible kind of citizen or somebody who's concerned in the end about the end goals of development, about which is about the most vulnerable. I certainly appreciate your stance there and being kind of upfront about it. But I would say I would wrap up by the following thought that what by going back to the theme that has been in my head since I read your book last summer and then reread it recently, is the following: that of course we don't want to randomize different states doing bad policies or whatever, bad objectives, and then say whether good state capacity, bad government, and good state capacity, good government, and so on. So that I agree would not be feasible or ethical and so on. But we could also exactly exploit the kind of interstate heterogeneity, because India, as we know, is that way, is more like Europe, right? I mean, it's sort of, it's a country, but it has different regions, different languages, different cultures, different, governments, right? And one could perhaps exploit looking forward, right? I mean, in sort of, one of the directions of future research is the same set of state capacity improvements with different states with different profiles, maybe, center state political alignment, and a bunch of other things you could think about. And that might give us some insight
Mhm.
about what these safeguards could be. So that's a much more constructive way of putting it than, like, as I said, at first glance, you might think this is more I think Becker and Mulligan had a paper, but idea goes back earlier, that they want taxes to be inefficient, because if taxes are too efficient, then government will just use more and more of taxation. So therefore, from a very libertarian point of view, you want tax systems to be somewhat inefficient, right? This is a classic second best argument. But hey, Karthik and we could go on forever, and we often do when we meet. And this has been a really, really stimulating discussion. I hope those who are listening to would at least partly agree with that. And I want to thank Karthik for, first of all, the impressive work and in a certain area that he has done over the years, but also continuously engaged with policy and in some ways never sort of showed the fact that, you have an interesting RCT idea or whatever, some other idea, doesn't have to be RCTs, and then you move on to greener pastures, which as researchers, we are sometimes tempted to do. We run after the most interesting problem, but I think his kind of commitment to policy improvements and to get better development outcomes, I think is truly something that is not commonly seen, because he has combined that with doing really cutting edge research. So thank you, Karthik, for joining us in this discussion. And I'm sure we'll have many other discussions going forward. But let's conclude the conversations here, unless you have any last word.
No, thank you, Maitreesh. I think, like you said, yeah, we basically just like scratch the surface. So I do urge listeners to, pick up the book. And the one thing is, though the book looks very big, it's very modular. You can just pick up any chapter you want and just read it and kind of, just have a lot just there. So thank you, and look forward to chatting more in future.